7 days in September shake the Senate, and the money power rewrites history in free money review. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 17th of October 2024. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robbie Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Lisa.
And on today's show, we're going to talk about an update on the misinformation and disinformation inquiry going on in the Senate, which has made history.
And a huge shock wave has just hit the Senate.
Bodes well for the defeat of this bill.
Yep.
And then we're going to talk about what the RBA, as the local hand of the money power, has had to say about its COVID-era money printing program to benefit the banks.
The term funding facility, they just conjured $180 billion out of nothing to give it to the banks. And now there's a bit of an autopsy about what went wrong or what went right.
A not very informative or a misinformative or disinformative autopsy, you could say, for want of a better way to put it. But please like the show, comment below, circulate it as much as you can, all to help get these ideas out. And if you can, please consider donating. There's a button below where you can do that. And thank you again to everybody who has donated and made the work we do and the broad campaigns that we're running possible. And speaking of which and what we're about to launch, before we get into the topics proper, we want to mention that we have just issued, hot off the press, a election flyer which lays out who the Citizens Party is for those who don't know. And of course, everyone of you out there, I'm sure you've come across people that you talk to about what we're doing and the ACP's policy ideas who haven't heard of us before.
Yeah, it's often, we hear that often. I've never heard of it, never heard of you, I've never heard of them. So one of the points we make in this flyer, Elisa, who are the Citizens Party and what have they ever done for you, is we're not one of the many modern splinter parties. We're a real party. We've been going for 36 years. We have a history, we have a record, and people can, and just to brag a little bit, we've had some successes, including surviving 36 years, and not just surviving, we've thrived. We would have the biggest staff in our national office of all the parties, including the major parties in Australia, the biggest staff. We are well supported around the country because people believe in what we're doing, and we always have been. And we've done plenty of stuff that you should know about us. If you don't know about us, you should ask the question why, and we give the record there of what we've done over those decades. And we've been, I think we've both been at this for those 3 decades. Most of that, I'm 31 years now in the Citizens Party. You're probably 30. So yeah, we've got a record people can point to. We lay it out in there. And we end with this itemising the more recent successes that we've had, which have been real breakthrough successes, most notably what we've been able to do with the campaign for a public post office bank, right? And that's the big one. So we've had a lot of successes in stopping things, bad things happening, stopping bad bills, etc. But we're now on the cusp of achieving a positive policy outcome for Australia, and we're not even in Parliament yet.
Yeah.
And so, if we can do this from outside of Parliament, what could we do if we actually got into Parliament? And that's why we've done this for the election.
And if you think about really what this misinformation and disinformation, this mad bill is designed to do, there's been an unofficial one against us for that entire history. We've been black banned. That's why people haven't heard of us. So what is about to become official and across the board has in effect already been applied to us, and therefore the import of that, of what we're about to talk to in our first segment, really shines through.
I think you made a really good point there. It's no accident that our accelerated success has coincided with the social media era. Our YouTube program is, 13 or 14 years old now, right? And we put it to good use. We aren't the biggest channel on YouTube, but we have a whole record on YouTube. People can go and check that out as well. And we've always used YouTube to get the word out and activate people, and other forms of social media. We're on them all. but there was a time from the mid-90s onwards where social media wasn't a thing, and there was clearly a decision made in the mainstream media, don't cover the Citizens Party, or the CEC as we were called then, and that worked. We kept people in the dark about us all around Australia.
And there was a virtual spell checker that whenever our name did
That's right.
very occasionally pop up in the media, it would always be prefaced by the far right wing, the extremists, the anti-Semitic. Fringe group, that's right, even though you don't have one.
Even though I don't have one. If they can rein in social media now and create a regime where the social media companies are forced to preemptively censor anything that strays into the areas of politics that we talk about, then they can go back to keeping a party like us suppressed, right? And it's certainly one of the reasons that we're fighting it. And just quickly, Elisa, we've done this for the election, but we've also done it in time because on the 17th of November, we're having our national conference. Craig Isherwood mentioned this last week. And so just to remind people, if you're interested in coming to our national conference here in Melbourne, the link where you can register is below. We need people, you can't just walk in off the street, we need people to register for the conference. But that is where we will launch our platform that we're taking to the election.
Yes, excellent. And you can download this flyer from our website, print copies, or call us, as always, to get a copy of the alert service, to get extra flyers to join the campaign. Now, on to our first topic. 7 days in September, shake the Senate. Now, as we've mentioned, the misinformation, disinformation bill, there's a red hot rush to get this through. And that is because, as we're infamous for saying, you know, this is preparation for a new global financial crisis much worse than what we saw in 2008. And therefore, one of the key elements of the MAD laws is to prevent people saying things that could question the integrity of the financial system or financial framework. The second issue is war. You know, world war is on the cards, and there are imperial parties that want that. But if you're able to talk openly and debate the real issues, if you can get dialogue and, dare I say, diplomacy among the parties involved, if that can be brought into the sunlight, there's a chance that war is diffused. And the parties that want war don't want that to be diffused.
And what the warmongers do always, Elisa, is they pick the target for war and then they lay the foundation for that war by doing what they call manufacturing consent. There's a famous analysis of this. A lot of people will be familiar with that term. And that's always based on the most, they come up with the most wild, outlandish claims about how evil that target for war is. And therefore, anyone who questions the narrative becomes an apologist for evil.
Yeah.
Right?
Appeaser.
An appeaser. And therefore, we are doing harm by questioning the narrative. And if they can bring in a regime to shut us down. So for instance, the Citizens Party, since, well, quite a few years now, but because American neoconservatives, the very people dripping in the blood of 1 million Iraqis, and the monstrosity they did in Libya and what they've tried to do in Syria and unleashing ISIS in Syria and these places, those very people around 2017 turned around and said, oh, China is evil. China's a threat to the world. We're going to have to take them on. And we said, you're full of it, you're liars. We saw you liars in Iraq, you're liars now. And so we've had to, this has been a challenge for our supporters to actually even understand why we were motivated to contradict these lies, because unfortunately China is an easy place for people to be made afraid of. But we have a whole division of our editorial here that says, okay, what's the latest claim? What can we prove about? Is there any proof for what they're saying? And inevitably we find, no, it's a pack of lies, and here's why, and we present it in our publications, etc. Because a lot of the other wars seem to be on the other side of the world and don't automatically affect us unless something like Ukraine turns into a nuclear showdown. But we're focused on China a lot because that will blow the smithereens out of our country if we're dumb enough to talk ourselves into a war to please the Americans, right? And so the people who want that war, and the Americans who want to use Australia as a proxy for that war, like they're using Ukraine as a proxy, they don't like what we're saying, right? No. They would love to shut it down and use this kind of power to shut this. So John Lander, when I interviewed him the other day, agreed this is wartime censorship.
Yes.
Right? And it's about the regime, the current regime, maintaining control.
Yes. So in the mad rush for the mad legislation, even though the legislation was sent to a Senate inquiry, they allowed 1 week, and they gave short notice for that week, but 1 week was allowed for people to make inquiries, submissions, I should say. So that's their public consultation, a week. They are now doing hearings.
There's a hearing going on as we speak, and there was a hearing on Friday.
Yeah, so now the big news though is that one of our supporters called up the inquiry and said...
Well, we can name the supporter because his name's Garth Gilbert. He's a legend. Garth is an angry but thoughtful Vietnam vet from Brisbane. And Garth has been making a big impact on our campaigns going back to 2017. Love you, Garth. So Garth did what Garth does. He called up the Senate committee and said, "What gives? Why have you only published submissions from organisation? Doesn't the ordinary Joe get to have a say?" And they said, "No, it's just because we're so busy." He said, "Well, what's the problem?" And the committee secretariat person he spoke to said, "Well, we've received over 15,000 submissions." And when I heard that, it was like, whoa, 15,000.
And over could mean anything over 15. They might not have counted them all even.
Now, if this is your first Senate inquiry you've ever paid attention to, you might think that you might not be impressed by that figure. But our party has been involved in Senate inquiries for a long time. And when we first got involved, we were used to inquiries that would receive 30 or 50 or maybe 100 submissions.
And that was a pretty high level,
That was a good level of engagement.
Quite a few,
right?
quite a lot when you go back and look at them historically have half a dozen.
Exactly. We got involved in inquiries and we started generating high hundreds of submissions, sometimes into the early thousands of submissions. And our previous success, the really big one we previously did was when they tried to ban cash transactions over $10,000 in 2019. There was an exposure draft that we worked with people like John Adams and Martin North and other organisations to generate submissions. They gave us 2 weeks to generate submissions to the exposure draft. That received about 4,400 submissions in 2 weeks, and we were super impressed with that. And then that led to a Senate inquiry like this one, and that Senate inquiry would have been 2 or 3 weeks for submissions, and they received 2,600 submissions. And we knew that was a lot of submissions. So just think of those numbers, 4,400 and 2,600 back in 2019. Last year, they did the exposure draft for this bill, and that exposure draft, which was open for submissions for quite a few weeks, that received 24,000. And to their credit, that was enough for the Liberals. Even though the Liberals initiated this bill, when the Liberals saw 24,000 submissions to the exposure draft of the bill, they said, "Okay, not for us, we're out of here. We want to get re-elected, thank you very much." So now the Senate inquiry, and this is even more impressive because they only gave a week. But on the other hand, I think by giving a week, they actually did us a favour because everyone took it really seriously. And our regular viewers remember being told a few weeks ago, make a submission. And 1 week to get 15,000 submissions is mind-boggling. This is a shock wave that's just hit Parliament House. And those members of Parliament know that they have something very hot here. And those who are sympathetic to this bill and want it, they know they're taking enormous risk now, political risk, pursuing it.
And even these public hearings, well, you can't even call them public hearings actually, because the hearings were called with such short notice. None of the public could get there. We would have had the room filled, except for last Friday, the first one was held. I think they had 48 hours notice given.
36. So the witnesses got 36 hours notice to attend the hearing on Friday. The witnesses
didn't even have time to prepare properly.
The public was notified by the website the night before for an inquiry that's starting at 9 o'clock. And then they've just done the same thing. Last night, after 10 o'clock at night, they put up on the website, there's a public hearing today. And again, the witnesses would have been given very little time to very little notice to prepare. This is a process that the government is deliberately trying to rush because they're just going through the motions here, and people that alone should alarm everybody when they want to push through a bill like this. But
give a bit of an insight into what came out of the hearings that we know so far.
All right, so I got to watch some of them, and then I'll credit one of our good activists in Brisbane, Hazel. She watched the whole hearing on Friday, and she took detailed notes. We've written a report. with her in the alert service for this week. Essentially, her point is if you're a parliamentarian, like a senator, who's interested in understanding how this bill works, you will not be learning anything from these hearings. Nobody is speaking to the whole bill and the whole agenda. They're speaking to just narrow parts of the bill or their own self-interest. There's a theme that's coming out of these hearings where people are willing to go and testify and say that, pay lip service to, oh yeah, we support the need to combat mis and disinformation. And of course, who's not going to say, who's going to come out and say, oh, we love mis and disinformation?
Yeah.
No one is, right? So they say, oh yeah, we support the aims of this bill as long as we're exempt.
Yeah.
In other words, and they're just speaking their own self-interest, right? And so one of the themes that's coming out is, and I'm most interested in what Sarah Hanson-Young, the Greens senator, is asking about, because this bill hinges on the Greens support. And she's the key senator in the Greens who's responsible for this as part of her portfolio area. And unfortunately, the Greens have a very strong division of Labor, and all the others will defer to her on it. And so one thing she's strongly queried now is, why is the mainstream media exempt from this? Because they are, along with academia, exempt. And so, but the problem is, to me, the bias, that puts the bias in the wrong way. It's not going to make the bill better if the mainstream media is included. It's going to make it fairer. We're all going to be gagged, but it's not going to make it better, right? We should, if the mainstream media can be excluded, as capable as they are of peddling the most horrible lies, anytime there's an agenda to pursue, then everybody should be excluded, right? That's how it should be viewed. One thing that I wanted to highlight, I'll pay credit to people like Senator Malcolm Roberts, Senator Gerard Rennick, Senator Matt Canavan. They've been participating in these inquiries and they're asking very sharp questions because they do have a commitment to free speech. But I'm not even going to call it paying credit. There's an organisation called the Institute of Public Affairs. Nobody in Australia has been a greater critic of the Institute of Public Affairs than the Citizens Party. We've been going after them for nearly 30 years because they are the bastion of policies like privatisation, right? And we think that's destroyed our country. So they're one organisation. I'm not going to say stick to your day job because their day job's quite bad, but they are traditional liberals, and so they have taken a free speech position on this, and their arguments are very sound, and they gave good testimony. But they pointed one thing out that I thought people should take on board. The concern they expressed is what is passed here in Australia, if this gets up, could become global regulation. And the reason that's the danger is everything that this bill will require the social media companies to do, the media companies will do through algorithms. And the algorithms are very powerful. And, during the COVID era, people saw those algorithms at work. Even now, there's all these basic algorithms that any random YouTube video you bring up, if it's on a subject that's slightly sensitive, you'll get a warning notice. So even if they don't block it, they'll give you a warning notice. That's the algorithm doing that. That's not someone back in Google headquarters doing that. That's the algorithm, right? We fell afoul of that a few weeks ago because we talked about a very sensitive subject to do with the report into soldiers taking their own lives. And I've used that term deliberately because the label for that is actually an area that flags the algorithm, right? And so that show of ours got hardly any views compared to our normal shows. That's how powerful the algorithms are. Now, in COVID, it was done sort of spontaneously, and we now know the US government was calling up the social media companies saying, take this down, take that down, take the other down. And now there's a huge backlash to that. And even Mark Zuckerberg came out from Facebook and said, that's how it worked, and he regrets doing it, right? So if we in Australia pass this law that forces them to design algorithms so that free speech can be preemptively censored here, well, they're most likely going to apply those algorithms to the whole world. So it's all automatic, and they'll just call it content moderation, but it's all automatic to comply with Australian law. And that's what the IPA submission said. Look, this is the danger that if we let this pass in Australia, then we become the reason there's a global censorship regime put in place.
Yeah, no, because they're not going to want to tailor it to different countries.
No.
Now, I want to raise another issue, and that is, given that professional journalism is excluded from the MAD laws, there's now everyone's scrapping to talk about, well, who's involved, who's included in professional media, who's not, etc. And one of the things that has emerged is this new outfit called Journalism Australia Limited, of which Peter Grester, the journalist and Macquarie University academic, is involved. And it's meant to be a body to set professional standards for the craft. But it basically, as various legendary journalist Mary Kostakis described it as, this is about control, she said. And one of the key points, to my mind, is that the standard of professional journalism would not include, for instance, WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
And that's a big, big factor, if that's what you're doing, because it then gives another pathway for the government to suppress whistleblowers. And
WikiLeaks, remember, was, there's no journalism that's been more consequential in the last 20 years than WikiLeaks.
No.
But Peter Grester, who trades on the fact that he was a journalist prisoner in Egypt for 400 days or whatever, has got a reputation out of that. But he was one of the journalists that sneered for a long time, Julian Assange is not a journalist.
Yeah.
And so this, if there's a standards body for journalism that does anything other than test them on spelling and grammar, right? It becomes a way of controlling information.
Mm-hmm.
And before social media, that's how it worked, because the journalists inevitably worked for a big company. They don't work for themselves. And the big companies, inevitably, the private ones are owned by the richest people in the world. And they always have been. Like we talk about Murdoch. Well, go back before Murdoch. It was William Randolph Hearst. It was all these famous names, right? And they all use their media for their ends. And their journalists, oh yeah, we're free speech journalists. Yeah, right. Until your boss says, no, you're not printing that. And that's how they could always control the media. And what used to happen is governments, prime ministers and presidents would call up their buddies like Rupert Murdoch or William Randolph Hearst back in the day and say, don't let that in. And they'd make sure it wouldn't get in.
And that's why there's such a big network now of independent media.
Exactly.
I mean, look at Michael West Media, look at Pearls and Irritations. I mean, so many people from the mainstream press quit in disgust at one point or another in recent years.
And social media has given them a platform, right,
Yeah.
that they wouldn't have had before.
That's right.
So that's a very good example of how dangerous that is.
But I wanted to raise it because in talking about suppression of whistleblowers and this being another pathway to do that, we wanted to raise David McBride's case. And I think we reported on an earlier show that he was able to, he's been given the go-ahead to put up an appeal now. Yeah,
the court's given him leave to appeal. So that appeal is underway. However, we put out a statement yesterday, Elisa, and people should click on the link below and have a look at this. We're calling for everyone to start campaigning for McBride to be pardoned. Because it's both a travesty of justice, against a very, brave Australian hero and his family, but he should also be considered a symbol of free speech, because he went through the channels to try and expose what he did, and it got nowhere, so he had to leak it.
Yeah.
Now, even then, what he leaked, which became known as the Afghan files, ABC moderated because as he's told me and others, there was a whole bunch more to his leak in those documents that has never seen the light of day, right? So there's a lot more truth that could have come out. But the way the government, first the Morrison government, now the Albanese government, has treated him, here's an example that they're not interested in people finding out the truth about things. The truth has embarrassed them. And if they can have a misinformation, disinformation regime that can suppress that kind of information as well, they absolutely will, because in this guy's case, they could have, now consider what's happened. Based on his leak, there was an inquiry headed by a Major General of the Army, General Sheridan. It confirmed everything that came out of David McBride's leak. The government acknowledged the crimes. They identified 23 instances of unlawful killings of 39 people in Afghanistan. The government has compensated the families of those victims, and most recently, the the people involved up to a certain rank who oversaw it have secretly, but we don't know who they are, but they've been stripped of their medals. But that's just secretly. No one knows who they are. There's a dozen or so commanders. So, in other words, everything McBride said was true, right? And that's thanks to him we know it. So the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus and Anthony Albanese, got elected on a platform of protecting whistleblower disclosures and protecting whistleblowers. Mark Dreyfus had the power to say, well, these charges against McBride should not go ahead because what McBride did was in the public interest. He refused to use those powers, and so the court case went ahead. They used national security concerns to deny him the access to the information. He had the information, the access to use it in court for his defence, so he couldn't have a defence, and he ended up pleading guilty because they took away the base of his defence on national security grounds because it implicated an ally of Australia, i.e. America. And then the judge had a range of penalties for what David McBride did. Remember, he's blown the whistle on war crimes and proved to be correct. A range of penalties ranging from a few months of house arrest with an ankle bracelet to 10 years in jail. He gave him 5 years and 8 months in jail. And the same judge has given repeatedly, not once, repeatedly given rapists in the ACT less than that, repeatedly. And even then, the government did something else to influence it because Richard Marles had received a report 2 weeks before McBride's trial, and the report was from an oversight panel that looked into the Brereton inquiry to see how good that inquiry was, that confirmed everything McBride said. The only thing they disagreed with from the Brereton inquiry was when Brereton recommended that no one in the top brass should be charged. And the panel said, we disagree with that. And the whole purpose of McBride going public was to actually make sure the top brass was held accountable as well, not just the soldiers scapegoated, right? So this expert panel said, we agree with that. Here, Defence Minister, here's our report. We think the top brass should be gone after. There's nothing in this report that requires you to keep it confidential. You can release it straight away. And instead, Richard Marles sat on that, so it wasn't made public before the trial, and it would have influenced the trial, and it wasn't made public before his sentencing because it would have influenced his sentencing. And it was made public only because of a request from Senator Malcolm Roberts. So he was sentenced in the morning. I sat there in the court for 2 hours and listened to this torturous screed he read out before he finally got to the damn point. And it was a crushing sentence, 5 years and 8 months. And that evening, Richard Marles' office released this report that would have mitigated it. So that's a government they're full of it. They've got no concern for whistleblowers. Plus, they do not want the public to ever see the truth about anything. And we're going to let them set up a misinformation, disinformation regime?
Yeah, exactly. Now, look, if you're able to get the truth out, people respond. And I want to talk about that was a good win this week that we had, getting that news about these 15,000 submissions. But there was another win we had, and it's also a result of our ability to get truth to the population using social media and other things that may soon be cut off, to stop bank closures. And so this week, we had been campaigning for a fortnight in Murwillumbah in New South Wales to stop the closure of the local ANZ branch. And earlier this week, we were scheduled to go on the Wednesday to have a big rally in Murwillumbah, but earlier in the week, ANZ announced they weren't going to close that branch anymore. And they're only going to keep it open 2 days a week, which is not enough. And obviously we're not going to let that go. And that's why we still had our rally, and we'll put up some pictures there. We had a great presence in Murwillumbah, and from the visit there the previous week, we had recruited a whole group of locals and business people who want to support a postal bank, who want to support keeping cash and so forth. So this was a really excellent intervention and an important win, and it comes in the context of having already, because you can force banks to back down. You can force the government to back down. And one of the things, as our regular viewers will know, is that the government has put a government-owned postal bank back on the agenda, quote unquote, to quote the Australian. So they are looking at, which was the result of the inquiry into regional banking closures, they are looking at setting up a postal bank in some capacity. It's all unknown as of yet, but we're of course going to be there to push it all the way. Independent Senator now, Gerard Rennick, raised it last week in the Senate, demanding that the government provide an official response to the recommendations, which they were due to do by about the 24th of last month, I think it was, and they haven't yet given an official response to the recommendations, which include establishing an expert panel into the benefits of establishing a postal bank. So he's pushing that process forward. The government's response was pretty hopeless. They gave an initial response where, I mean, they defended the right for cash, which was good, but then Anthony Chisholm, who gave the response, went on to cite the protections of the Australian Banking Code of Association's Code of Practice, which came out of the Regional Banking Task Force, which gave the green light for 92 closures of banks, which is why we and these senators said we need a proper inquiry, which resulted in these recommendations, including a postal bank.
And I think, Elisa, one thing you're illustrating there is we have consistently shown for a while now that you can actually influence outcomes in politics, including a really big outcome like this that's positive, but it's through our method of galvanising the public around these issues and mobilising people and activating them and not letting off. That requires communication.
Yes.
And we've used social media to do it. But in some of these areas that are in the bill, such as they've explicitly put in there, disinformation or misinformation that can undermine confidence in the banks and the financial markets, right? By having that kind of language in there, we're always undermining confidence in the banks. I mean, are you kidding?
Well,
they're the worst thing in Australia. They have screwed up our economy royally just so they can be this big parasite sucking out massive profits. And no one should have any confidence in the banks.
Well,
right?
Our next topic is all about that, actually.
There you go. And you can see why they want this bill.
Yeah, no, exactly. So we may as well go there now. The Money Power rewrites history in Free Money Review. So let us undermine confidence in the banking system yet again, while we still can. Now, we're talking about what is called the Term Funding Facility. This is a COVID-era program to ensure that the banks had enough money flowing through freely to supposedly keep the economy going. But apparently in this case, the economy means the housing bubble.
And the borrowing, the lending of this money went for a year or so. And by the time they finished lending, it was over $188 billion that they had lent through this program.
Yeah.
Initially, when they started lending it, the cash rate was 0.25%. So that's what the banks were borrowing it at, 0.25%. And then the Reserve Bank dropped interest rates. And so the bulk of the money that was lent was at 0.1%. And this is money, by the way. You might say, well, where'd the Reserve Bank get it? It invented this money. This is the power of a central bank. It just made this money up, right? So the banks borrowed it and they were supposed to lend it into the real economy and support lending, especially to small business. But they also had the option, because of the way the Reserve Bank works, that if they just parked it back with the Reserve Bank, they would get the Reserve Bank's interest rate. And at first there was no incentive for the banks to do that. But as interest rates started going up in 2021, starting in 2021, suddenly there was a spread between what the banks had borrowed this money out of 0.1% that they're paying back to the RBA, and if they parked it with the RBA would pay them the new interest rate. And of course, the new interest rate is now 4.5%, right? And that money, until this money was paid back, the banks were getting the difference between 0.1 and 4. Over 4%. Free money. That's why we're calling this free money. Free money from the RBA.
And we're talking about this because the RBA has just done it did an initial review earlier, and it's just done a final review of the program, which Christopher Kent, the Assistant Governor for Financial Markets, gave a speech about last week. And he basically admitted all of the faults that we just mentioned. I mean, if you read through his remarks, he doesn't come out and say, this program failed, but everything he goes through shows it was a failure. He shows the money was unnecessary. It did not increase business lending. It essentially triggered inflation, particularly in the housing bubble. It fueled the housing bubble, they admit, and it resulted in financial losses to the Reserve Bank. And yet, he concludes the TFF delivered on its goals, and in that conclusion he says we would use this method again if it was necessary, and in fact it's going to become part of our unconventional monetary policy toolkit.
Yep.
So just to go through those things one by one, it was unnecessary. Christopher Kent said the late take-up of the scheme, in other words, in the period that the banks were given to call on these funds, most of it was taken up. They only took up 60% of the total funding in the first part of the program before it was extended, and 50% of that was taken up in the last month, just before it expired. So he said this late take-up, quote, suggested that the banks did not need TFF funding to compete for or to satisfy the demand for borrowing from households and businesses. In other words,
and I can tell you one of the reasons why, because this coincided with COVID, and there was a lot of lockdowns in COVID.
Yeah.
And when you're in lockdown, you're not spending as much.
No.
No one's spending money on petrol, right? Remember, petrol in Melbourne got down below $1 again for the first time. And so your savings in the bank are higher, and the banks can make the stock of money in the banks is greater. It's true they didn't really need this money, but the Reserve Bank would say, oh, we didn't know that, so we've got to make sure they had the money there in case.
Secondly, it did not increase business lending. That was the main idea of the program. Christopher Kent called it the insurance the RBA took out against a catastrophic economic outcome. So they wanted to make sure the business sector kept going.
And by the way, Lisa, this was one of the crimes of the way lockdowns were implemented, because so many small businesses went to the wall, and the governments who were implementing these lockdowns, if they were proactive, if they weren't laissez-faire, they could have done them in such a way to guarantee that no small business went broke. Yeah. And they had mechanisms like this. They could have made the RBA do this directly to those people. Yep. How would you? Let me pose a rhetorical question to the small business people watching this who got affected by the lockdowns in COVID. If the RBA came to you and said, look, you're not going to have any business for a while, but we'll lend you whatever you think you need at 0.1%. Would that have kept you going? They did that to the banks, and the banks were supposed to on-lend it to you, and they didn't. Yeah.
Now, so what the RBA said in its review, and they said this earlier too, is that there was no statistically significant effects of the TFF on bank credit growth for small to medium enterprises. There was also no increase of business lending for any business whatsoever, big or small, when you compared banks that got the TFF to ones that didn't get the TFF or weren't eligible for the TFF. And we'll put up graphs to show that while there was no increase, this first graph shows there was no increase in business lending. If you look in that grey period and look at the lines, there's no noticeable increase in those lines. It increased a while thereafter. But then if we put up the housing graph and you look on the left-hand side or the right-hand side on the red line in the grey bar region, you see that the housing bubble was fueled by this. Because the mechanism, this is how weak as water the RBA was on this. The mechanism to encourage banks to lend to business was the low interest rate. That was it. We'll give you money at a low interest rate, go lend to business. But there's no way that the RBA didn't make them do it.
But the RBA has a power to make them do it.
They could have made them do it, exactly.
It's called Section 36 of the Banking Act. And that gives the RBA the power to say to the banks, you shall lend in this kind of way. The RBA doesn't approve the particular loans, but they can give you the category of lending. they could have said to the banks, this money, this is for small, do not lend it to the housing market. This is for small businesses, right? And they didn't do that. And Jim Chalmers now wants to repeal that power for the RBA to even do that.
And the other mechanism was, they said, for every dollar that you lend to business, we'll give you another dollar of this free money. Or for every dollar you lend to a small to medium enterprise, we'll give you an extra $5. But that was not enough incentive. And as the RBA said, banks followed for commercial reasons. They pursued their own path and they lent most of the money into the housing market, mostly at fixed term mortgages, which built up, a lot of people to reset from their fixed term mortgages in 3 years when the interest rate then started going up.
And now we have a crisis in all the first home buyers since 2019 and all the people who rolled over their loans in the COVID period. They're the ones who copped it the most, the interest rate rises subsequently. And they're getting smashed, and they were the ones that the banks set up for this through this kind of lending.
And the RBA just said the banks did it that way for commercial reasons, right? So that fueled the housing bubble, which the RBA also admits in this report. Banks simply used the credit where it was most profitable. As the RBA admitted, monetary policy contributed to housing price growth. It contributed to inflation, which contributed to the rising interest rate, which meant that the RBA lost a cool $9 billion because they had to pay the banks who were borrowing at 0.1, 3 or 4% on the money they just had sitting on the books of the RBA rather than being lent into businesses or the real economy.
It contributed to the record levels of mortgage stress in Australia. It contributed to the record levels of rental stress in Australia. It contributed to the record levels of homelessness from people who can't afford sleeping in their cars in Australia. It's unprecedented levels. All of this because here's the RBA that has, it's government owned, it has the power to act as a national bank. Instead, the only time it does things that are generous is to the private banks and props them up and doesn't even put conditions on what it does. And we say, use the RBA as a national bank. Oh no, you can't do that. That sort of power will be abused. If you use that power to help people, that'll be abused. That's irresponsible. We've got to have an independent reserve bank so it can only do things responsibly.
Now, to have another perspective on that, I thought when I was on the RBA website looking for this TFF report that they'd done, I thought all my Christmases had come at once when I saw this headline about a speech given by the Brit that was imported onto the RBA board. He's the Deputy RBA Governor, Andrew Hauser. This was the title of his speech, From the Shadows to the Podium, Central Banks and the Press. I thought, oh, this is interesting. So he gave this speech at the Walkley Business Journalism Awards in Sydney on the 8th of October, where he gave the impression of pulling aside the curtain on the secret world of the central banks. Although the real message was nothing to see here, right? And what I want to do is show a couple of clips from this because this was from the question and answer, this first clip I want to show, because he said the big secret is there aren't many secrets. The only secret is interest rates, and we tell you all that.
And just bear in mind before we go to the clip, the rules governing the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland, the secrecy around it and its deliberations is enormous. And that's the central bank of central banks. And when Senator Gerard Rennick FOI'd essentially the Reserve Bank to say, I would like to see your communications with the Bank for International Settlements, he was told in no uncertain terms, no, you have no right to see them because we have to keep those secret, right? Because of the deliberations between them. So, and now this guy's about to tell you there's nothing to see here.
Gerard Rennick was told in Senate estimates that correspondence is confidential. And everything the BIS does is confidential. There's not even allowed to be minutes taken in any of their meetings. And all of our RBA honchos trek over there. It used to be at some points in history every month that all the central banks would converge. And whatever it is these days, they're in regular communication, but we're not allowed to see those communications. But there's no secrets, as we'll hear from Andrew Hauser now.
Point two is, sometimes people say, no, you must be great being a central banker, you've got all these secrets. The truth is, The dirty secret about central banking is there aren't many secrets. The biggest secret is obviously the interest rate decision. That's discussed in the board and it's put out almost straight away afterwards in the public statement. And from there on in, you're basically discussing material that's in the public domain. So, you know, whilst I know sometimes people, including in the financial market, clamour to come to these round tables, you know, in the hope they might hear something that's, you know, not in the public domain. They don't, and that's you know, perhaps they go away disappointed. I don't know.
So, and what's your opinion of it? Do you think that they should be like this one on the record, rather than off the record?
Great. I can assure you the dry nature of much of our liaison over time. I think if we put it on the video, people would probably say, "Dear God, can you please stop?" There's hundreds and hundreds of hours of it every month.
All right.
And
So
what's a POM doing running the Reserve Bank of Australia, for crying out loud? I mean,
well,
this is
this
just a
guy
joke.
was 30 years at the Bank of England, I should have said, trained at Oxford and London School of Economics. He's worked at the IMF. So, you know, he's been sent down here to help us manage things.
You get the strong
I
impression,
believe.
Elisa, because we have been part, Senator Rennick, Senator Nick McKim of the Greens, Senator Roberts, we've been part of an unprecedented wave of attack on the way the RBA operates and this idea of RBA independence, etc. That it's like, you know, the mother of the money power,
Yeah.
the Bank of England. We'll put up our famous old Australian Labor Party ad about the Bank of England strangling Australia. It is the original central bank of central banks, and it uses the BIS as a bit of a proxy. They've sent their key guy down here to shore up the culture of the internal RBA. And help combat what we're trying to do.
Well, there wouldn't be anywhere in the world where such a fight would
Nowhere.
have been put up towards central bank independence being strengthened, and even the push, of course, from sitting senators and MPs to wind back that independence and have the government in charge of monetary policy as it should be. So this next clip I want to show is very revealing of this whole picture, because the guy who established the network of central banks, the eclectic club of central bankers, as he put it, in the 1920s, was the head of the Bank of England, Montague Norman. And he was also one of the founders, with the Nazi Hjalmar Schacht, that established the Bank for International Settlements in 1930, and of course who sent their guys down here at that time to tell us to tighten the belt and, you know, do everything in our effort to set up an independent central bank so that they could prize control of finance out of the hands of government. Montague Norman's the key guy. So who does Andrew Hauser spend about half of his speech talking about? Roll the clip.
The high priest of central banking in the mid-1920s was someone called Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England. And Norman was a pretty strange character. He was a devotee of mysticism. He wore a long flowing cloak, and wherever he went, he travelled under a fake name of Professor Clarence Skinner. His communication strategy was succinctly summarised in the pithy phrase, "Never explain, never apologise." He regularly put those words into practice. When asked by a parliamentary select committee in 1930 to rationalise a particular course of action that he'd taken, he simply tapped the side of his nose 3 times and stared into the distance. Despite, or perhaps because of this unusual behaviour, journalists loved him. A breathless 1932 New York Times pen portrait was entitled "Banker and Legend." It purred, "Mr. Norman is all elusiveness, technique, finesse. He sits silent, discreet, unseen, exercising a power unthought of by old-fashioned tyrants and only glimpsed by alchemists of long ago poring over their crucibles." Sadly, that passion went unreciprocated. Indeed, Norman made titanic efforts to avoid the press at all costs. Once, when he was aboard a ship in rough seas, word reached him that reporters were gathering to question him at the next port, and he leapt over the side of the boat, shimmied down a rope ladder, and made his escape on a dinghy. Never explain, never apologise permeated every aspect of the Bank of England's operations at that time. Not for them, the modern paraphernalia of glossy reports, explainers and press conferences. For much of the 20th century, changes in official interest rates were communicated solely through the medium of a large printed card put in the bank's ornate lobby, and a simultaneous verbal announcement by someone called the government broker to traders in the government bond market. To effect that announcement, the broker removed his top hat, because of course he had to wear a top hat, stood upon a bench and bellowed at the top of his voice, Fleet Street's finest played no role whatsoever. Even when I joined the Bank of England in the early 1990s, the main job of the head of the press office was still said to be, with no real irony, to keep the bank out of the press and the press out of the bank. That mindset extended well beyond the United Kingdom. The US Federal Reserve, for example, was established in conditions of such extreme secrecy that those meetings to agree its charter in 1910 tried to pass off their discussions as a recreational duck hunting trip. 3/4 of a century later, they were still at it. In 1987, Alan Greenspan famously told members of the US Congress, "Since I've become a central banker, I've learned to mumble with great incoherence. If I seem unduly clear to you, you must have misunderstood what it was that I was saying." He was only half joking.
Now,
The grey eminence himself. When I heard that description, I'm thinking Voldemort from Harry Potter with his flowing robe and all this kind of stuff. Tell you what, it was eerie.
Now, Hauser then went on, because this is all the media there, right, to call on the press for their support to get the RBA's messages effectively across to the public, right? Now, interestingly enough, none of the media reported on this speech, at least at the time that I looked at it 2 days ago.
So they were brought into the RBA's confidence, and they've all kept it.
But see, this was his message to them. This was not for the public. He's pulling in the inner circle and
You're
saying,
on our side, boys
we're
and
letting
girls.
you into the secrets, but you don't have to go and report on this. But when there's important things, you have to put out the message. Now, of course,
Here's my card. I'll tell you what to say.
what they're also relying on at the same time, because this is the professional media that are excluded from
misinformation
bill.
laws. Yep.
So they're relying on the other side that the MAD bill will exclude other voices like ours, of course, from saying things that might question the integrity of the financial system at a point where it's going to be absolutely crucial to put those questions forward. So he was basically, trying to get on side all of the media. We need you in a preparation for this coming period, which, as we said at the outset of this discussion, the rush for MAD is because of the financial crisis, it's because of the war drive to protect the imperial ambitions of a collapsing Anglo-American hegemon that desperately wants to hang on to power.
I agree, and I was a bit curious about his name actually, Hauser. Given someone associated with the RBA called Hauser, maybe we should call him from here on in Unaffordable Hauser, because that's what the RBA has created, and that's what they've been trying to protect ever since they created it. As we've just gone through there, or Bubble Hauser. However, we'll have a bit of fun with that. Lisa, it's why we've got to stop this bill. So just to end on, as I've been telling everybody who listens, the key is the Greens.
Yeah.
The government cannot get this bill passed without the Greens, because the coalition, they've just run a mile from it. They read the tea leaves in terms of the 24,000 submissions to the exposure draft and 15,000 submissions. That's enough for them. They want to get re-elected. So it's going to come down to the Greens, and as far as I can tell at the moment, the Greens are actually biased in favour of the bill, because they bought into this whole narrative that misinformation is what cost the voice referendum, caused the defeat of the voice referendum, that sort of thing. And the fact that they're talking about misinformation in those terms, where they're not just talking about, say, bomb recipes on social media, right? But they're actually talking about it in terms of politics itself.
Yep.
That's how the context of this arose. Shows you how dangerous it is. So you've got to keep on contacting the Greens to say, do not support this bill. and have a look at our release that we put out about that this week, because we cited 3 examples just from the last few months where the Labor Party has attacked the Greens and accused them of spreading harmful mis and disinformation. And so the Greens have to be read the Riot Act. Like, you don't think this will be used against you
Yeah, exactly.
if you pass this?
Absolutely.
Right?
On
So
Gaza and all kinds of
keep
issues
on 'em, keep
which
on
we
'em.
noted. And please don't forget, look at the media release below about David McBride. Do email your local federal MP and Attorney General Mark Dreyfus demanding that he pardon David McBride.
Yep.
So that's it for this week's show. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
See you again next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.